I used to live in a rat reservoir. That was what the New York City government preferred to call it. Their words make it sound like a beautiful nature preserve. In reality, it was a biohazard, the world's worst petting zoo. During the summers, dozens of the fattest rats you've ever seen would perch on massive heaps of trash rotting on street corners. When I walked home from work each night, I literally had to watch my step because there were so many rodents scuttling across my path that I would crush them if I didn't pay attention. According to one recent estimate, more than 3 million rats inhabit the 5 boroughs. For New Yorkers, they've become a cultural symbol, like the trickster characters in fables. In 2015, a viral video made Pizza Rat the city's unofficial mascot. Later that year, a mysterious woman known as Zardulu the Mythmaker became famous for her rat-themed pranks and hoaxes. Rodents defy all man-made laws and institutions. They insist upon their own survival. It would be absurd and incorrect to say that most New Yorkers like their city's rats, but they do respect them, at least grudgingly. Bad though it is, modern New York's rat problem looks insignificant compared to Victorian London's. By 1800, London was already the world's largest city, and it continued to grow exponentially throughout the 19th century. Between 1780 and 1900, its human population doubled every 40 years. Its rodent population may have increased even faster. Imagine the smell of a metropolis teeming with horse dung, unrefrigerated beef and cheese, moldy potatoes, and wet hay. London was a banquet hall for rats, and absolutely everything was on the menu. Enter Jack Black, rat catcher. His name really was Jack Black, I'm not making that up, and he looked a bit like the movie star, so you can picture the protagonist from Minecraft if you want to. Black had a kind face with rough, uncombed hair and dark whiskers. His hands were scarred and pockmarked. He wore a bright green overcoat, a scarlet vest, and a heavy sash festooned with cast-iron rats. After 35 years hunting rodents, he'd become one of Victorian London's most distinctive characters. We know about Jack Black because the 19th-century journalist Henry Mayhew interviewed him as one part of London Labour and the London Poor, an investigative series that appeared in issues of the Morning Chronicle starting in 1850. In its final form, the series constitutes a massive trove of articles that document how ordinary people spent their days upon the city streets. Many of these people speak to us in their own words. Black, for instance, tells us that I caught my first rodents when I was about 9 years of age. I wasn't afraid to handle them even then. It seemed to come natural to me. Initially, he hunted rats with the help of his little red dog. Soon, he started breeding ferrets for the job instead. Black's beloved ferrets were well trained. They could wander on their own up to a block away before racing back when he called them. People liked to buy the animals he bred, including monkeys, which he sold to circuses and other street performers. Black was also well known for his taxidermies, for the fish he caught bare-handed in the River Thames, and for his bird calls, which were so realistic that he could lure wild nightingales to settle in his open palm. Black had an affinity for many animals, but rats appealed to him the most. He knew what they ate and how they bred. He could discern a sewer rat from a barn rat at a glance. Both varieties had bitten him more times than he could count. One bite had pierced his thumbnail, which caused shooting pains that reached his teeth. Another bite had torn a private part of his anatomy that he refused to name to Henry Mayhew. On 3 separate occasions, infected rat bites had made Black so feverish that he thought he'd die. Due to the unglamorous nature of his work, Black lived on the margins of society. He asked Mayhew not to tell his wife that hunger sometimes forced him to consume cooked rats, which were allegedly as moist as rabbits. During one more prosperous period of his life, he'd been able to afford a room at a warm, cozy inn on Regent Street. His daughter, he recalled, used to serve behind the bar to supplement the family's weekly earnings. She looked very genteel in her costume, a red velvet bodice embroidered with silver lace. Unfortunately, Black's debts, or his drinking habit, led to his eviction from the inn, and then his temporary exile from London. Sometimes Black's contractors asked him to kill the rats he caught. At other times, they let him sell the animals to buyers such as Jemmy Shaw, who owned what one of Mayhew's articles politely called a sporting house. Blood sports, including rat and dog fights, were a cheap and gory source of entertainment for the working class. Shaw, to that end, claimed to purchase more than 25,000 rats every year. Most of his suppliers, he complained, were the most ignorant people I ever come near. Really, you would not believe people could live in such ignorance. Talk about Latin and Greek, sir. Why, English is Latin to them. In fact, I have a difficulty to understand them myself. Shaw's words lead us to infer that most of his suppliers were seasonal migrant workers who flocked to London from the countryside after the harvest ended every autumn. They spoke their local dialects, not standard English, and they survived the winter by accepting any jobs that they could find, including trapping rats that scurried through ditches and alleyways. Unlike these seasonal migrants, Black was a full-time professional. Around the time of his 30th birthday, he received a government contract from the superintendent of Regent's Park and the London Board of Ordnance. Now licensed to hunt rats on public properties and inside military barracks, he began to advertise himself as Rat and Mole Destroyer to Her Majesty Victoria. Scholars have proven that he never really held a royal contract from the Queen. He just had a flair for showmanship and self-promotion. Black traveled through London in a cart painted with gaudy images of rats. When he found a busy public square, he set up a stage alongside massive cages full of rodents. One such cage, he said, contained 1,000 feral rats. While awestruck crowds gathered around him, he played with these animals like they were blind kittens. Once Black achieved local celebrity, he started veering into conman territory. For example, he took to performatively hunting rats using exotic pets like monkeys, badgers, and raccoons. He began to peddle homemade compositions that he swore were more effective than traditional rat poisons. He even claimed that he'd discovered a cure for rabies. Today, Black's greatest legacy is his creation of the humble pet rat. Throughout his life, he collected and bred rodents that he thought were pretty. Over time, their offspring became playful, soft, and affectionate. You could do anything with them, he said. I've sold them to ladies for keeping in squirrel cages. One such lady was Victoria, who bought a pair of Black's domestic rats. Another was the author Beatrix Potter, who dedicated the book Samuel Whiskers to her precious little pet of the same name. I've heard many times from many different people that domestic rats make excellent companions. They're reputed to be loving, loyal, and intelligent, almost like tiny dogs. Fair enough, I say, but I lived in New York for a long time. To my ears, a fancy rat sounds as appealing as a fancy bedbug. The rat catcher Jack Black was not an eminent Victorian. He was never wealthy. He was never socially respectable. His birth and death dates both remain unknown. Nevertheless, Black is, in my opinion, one of the most emblematic and endearing 19th-century Londoners we know of. Despite his lack of formal education, he accumulated a huge body of practical zoological knowledge and combined it with an apparently innate talent for marketing to carve out his economic niche in a big city. The story of his life reveals how people can subsist in the unlikeliest of ways, even when they don't have many resources at their disposal. Victorian London was the vibrant capital of Britain's global empire. But despite its wealth and power, many Londoners eked out precarious lives defined by the ever-present possibility of bankruptcy, illness, and death. In today's episode, I'll take you on a walking tour of the 19th century world's most populous city to examine how its poorest inhabitants survived, and even thrived, despite innumerable hardships. My name is Brian Reinken. Welcome to episode 3 of Melting into Air. Chapter 1. Debtors' Prisons. Debt was a fact of everyday life in 19th-century London. Many of the city's residents, especially those who'd migrated from smaller towns and villages, thought it was rude for vendors to demand immediate payment in exchange for merchandise. They preferred to run up tabs with their favorite grocers, butchers, and bakers. Under these circumstances, most debtors and creditors knew each other personally. Of course, vendors took precautions when they dealt with strangers, or with clients whom they knew to be untrustworthy. Some tradesmen required customers to sign an IOU after they made a purchase. Landlords who leased apartments to new tenants asked for reference letters and down payments. Customers of all kinds were occasionally asked to name a guarantor. Despite these cautionary measures, some debts went unpaid. People lived beyond their means, they lost their jobs, or they suffered sudden emergencies. In addition, small debts often snowballed into larger ones, especially when people borrowed from one creditor in order to repay another. If creditors decided to take legal action against people who allegedly owed them money, judges were entitled to approve arrests immediately. Once this happened, alleged debtors found themselves pursued by bailiffs, who were appointed by a court or sheriff, but who essentially worked as private bounty hunters. Bailiffs detained the people whom they caught in sheds, cellars, or attics. There, they forced detainees to pay court-appointed bail, plus the full cost of the accuser's legal fees, plus hefty bribes to compensate the bailiffs for their trouble. If someone couldn't pay the full cost of this ransom, then they'd usually be sentenced to a debtor's prison. Few of them would ever have the opportunity to plead their case in court. When creditors sent someone to debtor's prison, the law required them to give the inmate a fixed-rate per diem payment. In theory, this requirement deterred false accusations and compensated debtors for however many days of work they missed while rotting behind bars. In practice, the payment was usually too low to finance rent or grocery bills. It was also too low to deter false accusations. For example, a notorious scandal arose in 1835 when a London merchant accused his business rival of unpaid debts. While the accused struggled to prove his innocence, the accuser sold his property and poached all of his customers. Given that debt was ubiquitous, that the economy was volatile, and that unemployment benefits didn't exist, many people lived in constant terror of incarceration. Prisons, workhouses, and debtors' prisons all comprised a labyrinth of institutions engineered to trap the poor. Technically, these institutions were distinct from one another. Workhouse inmates were, by definition, unemployed. Debtors, on the other hand, often had paying jobs, albeit not jobs that paid well enough to keep them solvent. Furthermore, unlike convicted thieves and murderers, imprisoned debtors didn't serve specific term lengths. They walked free as soon as they paid off their creditors. Of course, fine distinctions between carceral institutions didn't always matter. In the real world, prisons, workhouses, and debtors' prisons served as pipelines to each other. Once you were entangled in the legal system, it became extremely difficult to extricate yourself. London's most infamous debtors' prison was the Marshalsea. Originally built during the Middle Ages, the complex was remodeled and reopened at a new location in the early 19th century. The debtors here were never chained up or subjected to hard labor. Instead, they were allowed to wander freely anywhere within the prison's walled-off grounds. To the south side was a pump, whose water smelled metallic on good days and putrescent on bad ones. To the north side were 3 simple privies. Near the privies was a prison alehouse, where the debtors used their creditors' per diem payments to buy food and alcohol. Unsurprisingly, the alehouse was more popular than the prison chapel. Debtors, including men and women, lived in tiny rooms inside 8 sparsely furnished houses in the center of the prison grounds. The Marshalsea was built to hold 110 people, or approximately 2 per room. Unfortunately, it was often overcrowded because many prisoners invited family members to move in with them. These family members, who were usually wives and children, rarely had a better option. Life outside the prison became unaffordable after the breadwinner had been incarcerated. Life inside the prison was much cheaper, but it wasn't free. Because the justice system tacitly assumed that debtors were a lazy class of economic parasites, it barely tried to stop officials from extorting them for bribes. Alongside exploitation from the prison's staff, incarcerated debtors faced corruption from each other. Senior inmates jostled for the right to serve as college secretary, an unofficial role that entitled them to extract so-called fees from other prisoners. There was no rule that said an inmate had to pay the secretary's fees, but anyone who didn't made a powerful enemy. If a prisoner couldn't afford the fees, that was no problem. The secretary would be very happy to defer your payment. You'd just owe him interest and some personal favors down the line. To regulate the social hierarchies that inevitably formed in prison, the inmates at the Marshalsea authored an unofficial constitution that enforced a basic level of equality among male inmates. The prison's women were excluded from consideration. Every Monday afternoon, all men were expected to assemble in the yard. Anyone who failed to do so would be fined. Once the men had gathered, they decided how to manage the week's chores. Who would boil drinking water? Who would scrub the privies? People who refused to take responsibility would be fined. Next, the men held trials for rule breakers. Anyone found guilty of stealing, fighting, swearing, urinating in the yard, or making too much noise after bedtime would be fined. Actually, fines were the best-case scenario. One unlucky inmate had the contents of the prison's chamber pots dumped on his head. Once per month, male inmates elected 9 delegates to lead their assembly meetings. Any man elected earned a weekly salary garnished from the other inmates' fines. This salary helped delegates pay their debts. The only other way to pay them was to beg for money from your loved ones, or to hope that some rich, charitable stranger would bequeath the city's prisoners a legacy in their will. Perhaps surprisingly, not all debtors wanted to leave prison. From a certain point of view, the Marshalsea was somewhere to live free from real life's pressures. Under ideal circumstances, inmates ate, they drank, they socialized. If their fellow prisoners liked them, they might even be elected to hold office. In 1815, an inmate named Jonathan Davy decided to remain behind bars even after he'd paid off the creditor who'd put him there. Like many of his fellow debtors, Davy owed money to multiple people, and he didn't see the point of leaving prison just for someone else to lock him up again. Taking advantage of one's freedom was a hassle. It was easier to just sit tight. Most of the Marshalsea's inhabitants were men from the lower middle class. Generally speaking, their jobs paid well and steadily enough that they felt comfortable accumulating debts, but not so well or steadily to guarantee that they could pay them off again. These men belonged to what we might call the Victorian precariat. An inmate named Joshua Reeve Lowe, for example, owned a store that sold eyeglasses. Jonathan Ewer Poole worked as a part-time painter, plasterer, and wallpaperer. Giles Hemmons was an undertaker. Robert Moggridge was a tailor, Bishop Sharp was a boxer, and William Park was an oboist. Alongside these men, all of whom were literate, and some of whom published accounts of their time in prison, there was a large group of illiterate prisoners, whose existence is harder to discern in the historical records. Women were always a minority among the prisoners. They lived in separate houses from the men, and they weren't allowed to vote or stand for office, but otherwise they intermingled freely with their fellow inmates. One woman, whose name hasn't come down to us, found herself imprisoned in the Marshalsea after she inherited her late husband's debts. Another woman, the wife of a linen draper, dressed herself in the sad, tattered remains of clothing that had once been fashionable. Her black silk pelisse was in rags, while her ostrich feather bonnet had grown faded from exposure to the weather. A few women rose to prominent positions in the Marshalsea. Elizabeth Short, for instance, managed the alehouse for 2 years. Another woman, known only as Charlotte, maintained a warm, clean room where prisoners told stories by the fire. The good reputations of these women were exceptions to a broader rule. Among men, most female debtors were the objects of suspicion and disgust. Late in his life, Charles Dickens still remembered seeing what he called a very dirty lady in the Marshalsea when he was just a boy. Dickens was visiting the Marshalsea because his father, John, spent 3 months living as an inmate there. 2 decades before his conviction, John was hired as a clerk for London's Navy Office. After transferring to Portsmouth in 1808, he married Elizabeth Barrow, and the couple started a large family. Unfortunately, John's career meant that their life was never stable. Because Navy bureaucrats were often shuffled between regional offices, the Dickens family lived in 15 different houses in a 12-year period. In 1822, the Navy moved John back to London and reduced his salary. His debts mounted quickly in the capital, where living costs were high. Within 2 years, he owed a single bakery the outrageous sum of £40. Although John had many angry creditors, this one finally landed him in prison. 12-year-old Charles watched his father weep on his first day inside the Marshalsea. A few weeks later, John's wife and their younger children moved into the prison complex. The money that they saved on rent allowed them to continue paying for their eldest daughter, Fanny, to live and study at the Royal Academy of Music. Charles, meanwhile, lived across the street from the Marshalsea. As he scraped out a meager income working long hours in a boot-blacking warehouse, his family confiscated his pitiful wages to finance their debts and his elder sister's education. Later in life, an embittered Charles reflected that, "I suppose my father paid my lodging. I certainly had no other assistance whatsoever from Monday morning until Saturday night. No advice, no counsel, no encouragement, no consolation, no support." John, he complained, was a jovial opportunist with no money sense. While the man lavished his dwindling resources on his daughter's music education, he compelled his prepubescent son to work a stultifying job in a dark and smelly room teeming with rats. As a parent, his behavior seemed an almost unforgivable betrayal. While Charles suffered, John lived relatively comfortably inside the Marshalsea. His abundant natural charisma led his fellow inmates to elect him chairman of the prison's 9-man committee, which allowed him to collect a weekly salary. He also continued to collect his paychecks from the Navy office without actually performing any of his duties. John decided not to tell his boss that he had been incarcerated. Instead, he claimed that he was too sick to come into work, and no one in the government bureaucracy bothered to check if this were true. In April 1824, John's mother died, bequeathing him a legacy of several £100s. Even when combined with his 2 salaries, this sum was insufficient to pay off his creditors. John, therefore, appealed to the British government, declared bankruptcy, and surrendered all his assets. The court allowed him to keep only £20 to start his life from scratch. In May 1824, John Dickens and his family left the Marshalsea. But their financial problems didn't end. Before long, they withdrew Fanny from music school because they could no longer afford her tuition. Over the following years, John's creditors repeatedly arrested him because he kept accruing debts. Charles, who was becoming a successful writer, always had to intervene to save his father from another term in prison. In return, a shameless John took advantage of his son's generosity by contacting his publishers and asking them for loans behind his back. In 1851, after decades spent disputing creditors and debtors' courts, the cycle finally ended when John passed away after a horrifying surgical procedure to remove a blockage in his urinary tract. The debt he owed outlived him. It would remain unsettled for a year after his death. Readers of Charles Dickens' novel David Copperfield will recognize John Dickens in the character of Mr. Micawber, a blustery but good-natured family man whose laziness and chronic inability to plan ahead land him in debtor's prison and imperil his friends' finances. Whenever someone asks him what his plan to get his life on track is, Micawber says simply, "Something will turn up." He's a beloved character, outrageously funny, endlessly quotable, but he's a difficult man to admire. Charles never overcame the shame and anger that he felt about his father's time inside the Marshalsea. In particular, he struggled to address the trauma of the months that he'd spent toiling as an underage bootblacker. Later in life, he admitted that, "I never had the courage to go back to the place where my servitude began. For many years, when I came near to the warehouse, I crossed over to the opposite side of the way to avoid a certain smell of the cement they put on the blacking corks, which reminded me of what I was once. It was a very long time before I liked to go up Chandos Street. My old way home by the borough made me cry, even after my eldest child could speak." Dickens' novel Little Dorrit, whose title character supports her father in the Marshalsea, identifies the debtor's prison as a fount of misery that permanently scars an otherwise angelic woman. In his preface to that book, Dickens recounts a visit that he paid to the defunct prison's grounds. The Marshalsea had closed in 1842, but he still heard the distant wailing of the crowding ghosts of many miserable years. Londoners like Dickens navigated their metropolis by means of invisible maps. They took long detours around memory-haunted roads and alleyways. They shied away from street corners where they had been abused. London was an archipelago of boutique shops and gorgeous gardens, but it could also be a city of confinement, terror, and despair. The wealthy men who patronized its galleries and opera halls were the same men who authored laws that locked the poor behind high walls and iron gates. Chapter 2. Street Vendors. Every morning, hungry Londoners swarmed Covent Garden, Leadenhall, Spitalfields, and Billingsgate, where they scrambled to buy produce from itinerant vendors in colossal markets. The sensory experience was overwhelming. Here, you could marvel at colorful mountains of strawberries, raspberries, cherries, currants, plums, and pears, not to mention every vegetable you'd ever heard of. Butchers hawked rabbits and poultry, eggs, milk, and cheese. Fishmongers peddled merchandise that was alive and swimming. Bakers sold fresh crumpets, bread, and muffins. All around you, vendors cried out, "Orange pips, chestnuts all lot, penny a score, buy, 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 buy. Half quire of paper for a penny, 2 pence a pound grapes, who'll buy a bonnet for 4 pence? Tables were stained purple with the juice of blackberries. Donkeys brayed loudly. Busy women pushed their way through crowds, scolding anyone who walked too slowly. Boys with pockets full of apples darted around grown-ups' legs. Sometimes they stopped to chat with child workers, who sold goods in tandem with their parents. In 1841, an official census counted 2,045 London costermongers, or itinerant food vendors. The true number was undoubtedly much higher. Some costermongers owned semi-permanent stands that rarely moved from place to place. Others pushed food carts more than 10 miles each day. According to the 19th-century journalist Henry Mayhew, about half of costermongers operated full-time family businesses. The other half consisted of part-timers, many of whom were impoverished emigrants from Ireland. During the midday slump, when customers were few and far between, costermongers played card games like Skittles, Shove Halfpenny, and 3-Up. They diced, they gambled, they sang bawdy songs, including one popular piece about Duck-Legged Dick and his donkey. Sometimes, if they'd sold enough merchandise during the day, they'd see a play in the evening. According to one costermonger, "Love and murder suits us best, but we consider tragedies too long. Of Hamlet, we can make neither end nor side, and 9 out of 10 of us, aye, far more than that, would like it to be confined to the ghost scenes and the funeral, and the killing off at the last. Macbeth would be better liked if it was only the witches and the fighting. Middle-class Victorians were fascinated by the nicknames costermongers gave each other. Some of these were pretty unremarkable. Curly had curly hair, Foreigner had served in the Spanish Legion. Others were more memorable. Spuddy was known for selling rotten potatoes until his Irish clients beat him up for it. Pineapple Jack sold fresh fruit. Many female costermongers' nicknames were more troubling than those of their male counterparts. Cast Iron Paul, short for Polly, received her name after someone hit her on the head with an iron pot. Blackwall Paul always showed up to work with 2 black eyes. Despite their fascination with the costermongers, many middle-class writers mistrusted them. Mayhew alleged that only 10% were married, and just 3% attended church. The latter figure is most likely incorrect. Costermongers may not always have attended services, but many of them, especially those who'd migrated from Ireland, were deeply religious people. According to Mayhew himself, if the costermongers had to profess themselves of some religion tomorrow, they would all become Roman Catholics, every one of them. Costermongers weren't the only street vendors who drew suspicion from the middle class. Match sellers were mistrusted too. Because this trade had almost no financial barriers to entry, it appealed to Irish emigrants and refugees who came to London after the Great Famine. Many of the city's match sellers were older women who lacked strength for more demanding jobs. Others, including Hans Christian Andersen's famous fictional Little Match Girl, were children. Mayhew complains about what he regarded as their irritating habit of staring into homes and shops until someone inside felt guilty enough to give them money. Most children were more fortunate than match girls. Boys with spare pocket change liked to patronize long song sellers, who sold sheets of paper covered with lyrics arranged in 3 columns. While the paper fluttered like white ribbons in the breeze, buyers sang lively choruses from Jim Along Josie, The Death of Nelson, Oh That Kiss, and Buffalo Gals Come Out Tonight, the last of which will still be recognizable to anyone who's seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Because the song sheets didn't include music notes, they can be very hard to read unless you already know the tune. For example, I have absolutely no idea how to sing a song whose lyrics begin chuckaroo-choo, choo-choo-choo-la. I'm equally unsure of one that starts with Paga dawe dusty canty k. And needless to say, I'm utterly baffled by Hottie Pie Gunny Po China Koo. Mayhew confidently, and completely wrongly, claims that this last song is written in Chinese. Long song sellers knew their target audience. So did street dog sellers, who congregated in Hyde Park, where doting parents and their spoiled children enjoyed summer afternoons outdoors. Dog sellers carefully cleaned and brushed their animals, then played with them in ways that would attract children's attention. Around 1845, King Charles Spaniels were the best-selling breed. French poodles were slowly coming into style too. Pugs were no longer popular, but they sold well once upon a time, provided only that the pug was hideous. Horses were the source of most Victorian pet food. London slaughterhouses sold every part of the animal. Skins were sent to tanneries, bones were ground into manure, fat was used to oil carriage wheels. Finally, tripe was packaged for the city's cats and dogs. Itinerant pet food vendors sold their wares from door to door. The canniest among them would remember where the hungriest pets lived. One Londoner with Newfoundland dogs was known to buy a massive heap of meat each day. Another Londoner bought 16 pennies worth to feed stray cats. According to Henry Mayhew, this woman's neighbors all resented her because she was attracting literally hundreds of animals who yowled and rioted beyond description. While some street vendors sold animal food, others sold animals. One such young man described himself as a seller of birds' nesties, snakes, slowworms, adders, effets, lizards is their common name, hedgehogs, for killing black beetles, frogs, for the French, they eats 'em, and snails. Every summer, this man ventured out into the countryside for 3 nights weekly. There, he climbed trees or buildings and snatched however many birds' nests he could find. He'd caught linnets, thrushes, moorhens, blackbirds, crows, starlings, goldfinches, and swallows. Woodpeckers were almost impossible to find, he said. Horned owl nests were tricky because they were located so high in trees. One time, the man fell from a branch into a dirty stream brimming with leeches. That accident hurt his foot so badly that he couldn't walk for 6 weeks afterward. Nevertheless, trading in birds' nests was a decent job. He sold about 300 per year, mostly to little boys. Selling birds' nests was a summer job. In fact, few of the professions I've discussed amounted to full-time careers. Instead, they offered short-term reprieve during periods of financial hardship. For example, rural laborers who struggled to find agricultural work in wintertime might migrate to London to seek jobs as street vendors. Alternatively, children sometimes worked as vendors to earn extra money for the household as a whole. There were, of course, some people who worked desperate jobs long-term because they had no other choice. This was true of a man named Old Billy, who'd been born with a physical disability that affected the joints in his limbs. Billy survived by selling pet birds, but he reflected frankly on the hardships that he faced.
"I'm still greatly teased, sir, with children. Yes, and with men too, both when they're drunk and sober. I think grown persons are the worst. They swear and use bad language to me. I'm sure I don't know why. I've never seemed to be a cripple in my dreams. Well, I can't explain how, but I feel as if my limbs was all free-like. So beautiful. I dream most about starving, I think, than about anything else."
The Victorian world was very challenging for people who had disabilities. There was no public safety net, and private charities weren't numerous enough to uplift everyone. As a result, most people who had disabilities relied on friends or relatives to support them. If these people had no friends or relatives, they'd face a stark choice between entering a workhouse or begging for food. Because the latter option was illegal, many beggars posed as street vendors so they would have an alibi in case the police arrested them. Blind Londoners, for instance, famously sold shoelaces. The proportion of blind Londoners was higher in the 19th century than it is today. An estimated 5,000 of them lived within a 5-mile radius of St. Paul's Cathedral, and there were many others elsewhere in the city. Most of these people had lost their eyesight to disease. One blind musician sang,
"I'm bound in dismal darkness, a prisoner I am led. Poor and blind, just in prime, brought to beg my bread. When in pleasant youthful days, in learning took delight, and, by the smallpox, I lost my precious sight."
Due to the hardships they shared, blind Londoners formed a close-knit community. They often intermarried, and they formed several well-known all-blind street bands. Blind people also became very close to their seeing eye dogs. One man's dog, Keeper, had been with him for 9 years. Before that, he'd had Blucher, with a tail like a wolf, an ear like a fox, and a face black like a monkey. Apart from their use as guides, dogs relieved the boredom of everyday life. Many blind people complained that they had no source of amusement. Before the invention of Braille, they couldn't even read to pass the time. "Blind people gets angry," one such man told Henry Mayhew, "when they hear people talk of persons seeing with their fingers. Someone has told me that a blind person in St. James's workhouse could read the newspaper with his fingers. But that, the blind know, is quite impossible." Of course, blind people weren't the only Londoners who couldn't read. Foreign sailors sometimes sold religious pamphlets on the street, but few of them could understand their own material. At least half of the pamphlet sellers, Henry Mayhew estimated, were Indians, Malays, or Africans who sold Christian tracts despite the fact that they were practicing Hindus or Muslims who didn't speak any English. 2 orphaned flower sellers, half-sisters aged 11 and 15, were lucky to be literate. After their parents died, an out-of-work Irish couple adopted them and apparently encouraged them to seek an education. The older sister boasted that she'd paid for their tuition, and she showed Henry Mayhew she was literate by reading excerpts from a Catholic book titled Garden of Heaven. Compared to these two sisters, many children in similar situations were less fortunate. One 13-year-old was sent to prison for selling combs in the winter, when flowers were out of season. After she was released, she spent several months fruitlessly trying to get back on her feet. At last, she decided that she'd rather be fed in prison than starve on the street. She broke lamps and threw her shoe at London's Lord Mayor so that the police would take her into custody. Flower sellers, whose work fluctuated with the seasons, often needed loans to purchase their inventory or to help them survive when their wares were out of stock. Rag and bottle shops took advantage of their desperation. Every winter morning, the half-sisters whom I mentioned visited a rag and bottle shop and sold the rug they slept on for 6 pence. Every winter evening, they returned to the shop and bought the same rug back for 7 pence. When rag and bottle owners weren't busy exploiting children, they were purchasing garbage and other worn-out goods that ordinary pawnshops wouldn't take. Wax, broken glass, lumps of iron, horsehair, waste paper, birds' eggs, dirty tea caddies, and empty knife boxes were all fair game. Allegedly, so were silver spoons that servants stole from well-to-do employers. Shop owners didn't ask questions. They inhabited a world of poverty, and they knew that absolutely everything could be resold to desperate people who had nowhere else to go. Absolutely everything included dog poop, or, as the Victorians called it, pure. One woman entered the pure-finding business after her sailor husband drowned en route to Bombay. She told Henry Mayhew that almost everyone I've ever known engaged at this were people who were better off once. While on the job, pure finders carried buckets topped with heavy lids. Some finders wore black gloves, but many dispensed with them because they were harder to wash than bare hands. For people who could overcome their gag reflex, pure finding was a job like any other. They sold the droppings they collected to tanneries, which extracted the alkaline and rubbed it onto skins. Pure finders were fairly legitimate business people. Toshers, in contrast, faced more social stigma. These adventurers searched London's sewers for copper nails, bolts, iron, or old rope that they could resell to rag and bottle shops. Some toshers stayed close to sewer grates. The more daring of them plunged deep underground. Either way, the practice was extremely dangerous. Sewer brickwork was unstable and prone to collapse. Lack of ventilation caused poison gas to accumulate in invisible clouds. Sluice gates open and shut with the tides, sending sudden floods of water down the tunnels. Huge, hungry colonies of sewer rats bit anything that moved. And there was even rumored to be a large population of feral hogs somewhere below the city. Strangely enough, few toshers died of disease. Given that many of them had been trawling the sewers since childhood, their immune systems must have been almost superhuman. Mudlarks were positioned one rung below toshers on the social ladder. Just like toshers, they accumulated garbage that they sold to rag and bottle shops. Unlike toshers, they were active only on the banks of the River Thames. When the tide was low, mudlarks waded out into the filthy water, collecting any solid objects they could find. Most mudlarks were children or very old women, who didn't have the strength for sewer exploration. Their working conditions, however, were still hazardous. Because mudlarks often waded barefoot, broken glass or long nails could puncture the soles of their feet. Hypothermia was another danger, especially in winter. Henry Mayhew caricatured mudlarks as crude, irreligious people. In contrast, he spoke very highly of dustmen. In an era before public garbage services existed, parishes commissioned private contractors to manage chimney waste. These contractors, who were called dustmen, typically worked by night. While the city slept, they collected the byproducts of coal fires, including white ash, cinders, and soot, along with whatever incidental objects might be left inside them. Then, they transported this waste to mountainous heaps of dust in London's suburbs, where they paid women to sift through the piles. The dustmen sold the solid objects that these women found to rag and bottle shops. Fine dust was repurposed as manure or mortar used for making bricks. If there's one thing to learn from all these street vendors, it's that Victorian London was a vast, sophisticated economic organism that recycled absolutely everything back into the market. The city's population was so large, and many of its people lived so precariously, that they couldn't afford to waste anything, including literal waste. For better or worse, London's filth was just about the only resource that seemed inexhaustible. Dustmen, purefinders, toshers, and mudlarks turned this circumstance to their advantage. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens coughed, sneezed, and sickened. Chapter 3. Infectious Disease. She was dead. There, upon her little bed, she lay at rest. The solemn stillness was no marvel now. She was dead. Dear, gentle, patient, noble Nell was dead. Little Nell, the heroine of Charles Dickens' 1841 novel The Old Curiosity Shop, became the 19th century's most famous emblem of a life cut tragically short by infectious disease. Her long deathbed scene is sentimental, even sappy. Oscar Wilde famously remarked that one must have a heart of stone to read it without laughing. Nonetheless, it deeply moved many Victorians, who reflected on their own lost children or on childhood friends who'd never had the chance to grow into adults. During the 19th century, Britain's urban population grew more quickly than its cities could sustain. Consequently, life expectancy in the metropolis was usually much shorter than it was in tiny villages. In London, families found themselves packed into tenements that overlooked dark, narrow streets flooded with foul water. As medieval sewers overflowed, women emptied chamber pots into the road. The River Thames became a poisonous current of feces, garbage, and industrial runoff. People had no concept of bacteria or viruses. It's no wonder that so many of them died so horribly. The ghastly state of public health attracted the attention of reformers. In 1842, the utilitarian philosopher and sociologist Edwin Chadwick published his Report on the Sanitary Conditions of the Laboring Population of Great Britain. Although the document made for dry reading, it immediately captured Parliament's interest. Chadwick emphatically rejected the prevailing notion that private, free market initiatives were capable of handling complex social challenges. Instead, he envisioned a state-funded public health program that would modernize Britain's sewer system and provide fresh, clean running water to every household in the country. Chadwick, a boring and conceited man who was fanatically obsessed with hygiene, struggled to raise money for his program. It took 6 years of effort for him to secure the passage of the 1848 Public Health Act, which established a central governmental board of health. Even then, his victory fell short of his hopes. Although the board could advise and collaborate with local governments on sanitation projects, it could neither finance those projects nor initiate them on its own. Despite the Board of Health's shortcomings, its creation reflects a broader 19th century revolution in the field of medicine. In 1800, British life expectancy at birth was approximately 40 years old, and 15% of children died before they turned 1. Physicians weren't uneducated people, nor did they uncritically accept established practices. Even so, bloodletting was a standard medical procedure. British doctors, furthermore, believed in the miasma theory of disease, which held that illnesses derived from bad smells. By 1900, Britain and the Western world at large had undergone an astonishing medical metamorphosis. In 1820, a French doctor developed quinine, an anti-malarial drug. During the 30s, European chemists synthesized new anesthetics like chloroform, morphine, and codeine. Halfway through the 19th century, Florence Nightingale laid the groundwork for modern nursing. Meanwhile, researchers like Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and Joseph Lister developed the germ theory of disease, a paradigm-shifting medical breakthrough that identified microscopic organisms as the cause of many illnesses. British doctors also studied non-infectious illnesses. Addison's, Parkinson's, and Hodgkin's lymphoma are all named after 19th-century physicians. By the final decades of the 19th century, a second industrial revolution was reinventing the fields of chemistry and pharmaceutics. As medicine became increasingly scientific, professional, and centralized, hospitals supplanted house calls, and the state began to play a more assertive role in public health. Some diseases grew much rarer in the 19th century. Although Edgar Allan Poe's nightmarish story, The Masque of the Red Death, imagined a lethal pandemic, the bubonic plague practically disappeared from Europe thanks to quarantine requirements in major ports. Unfortunately, the most common illnesses remained extremely dangerous. Influenza, measles, mumps, diphtheria, strep throat, scarlet fever, and whooping cough all devastated children. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss 3 of the 19th century's most notorious diseases: smallpox, tuberculosis, and cholera. I won't go into gruesome detail, but if you're squeamish, you may want to skip ahead to Chapter 4. Smallpox, the speckled monster, killed about 400,000 Europeans every year, and it infected 3 times more than that. The illness began with a fever. Within a few days, patients developed a pustular rash that looked like an outbreak of blisters. This rash sometimes grew to cover the entire body. Even if it didn't, patients experienced extreme fatigue and vomiting before the blisters finally burst, scabbed, and scarred. About 1 in every 3 smallpox survivors would go blind. But, fortunately, all survivors were immune to the disease forever afterward. This made vaccines the most effective way to combat it. In fact, the very word vaccine, which comes from vacca, the Latin for cow, is a relic of humanity's war on smallpox. One day in the 1790s, the English doctor Edward Jenner noticed that local milkmaids had beautiful skin free of smallpox scars. He soon learned that all these milkmaids had survived cases of cowpox, a relatively mild virus that circulates among cattle and their caretakers. Jenner correctly inferred that cowpox and smallpox were so closely related that people who contracted one disease would never develop the other. Building on this realization, he harvested a sample of infected pus from the sores of a cowpox patient named Sarah Nelms. He then rubbed this pus into 2 small incisions that he made on the arm of James Phipps, a local 8-year-old. Phipps developed cowpox, but survived. Over the following months, Jenner rubbed pus from smallpox patients into new incisions on the young boy's arm. Even after Phipps had been exposed to smallpox more than 20 times, he still hadn't fallen ill. His mild case of cowpox had conferred lifelong immunity against a much, much deadlier disease. In the decades after Jenner publicized his smallpox vaccine, many European states made vaccination mandatory for school children and government employees. In Britain, the Vaccination Act of 1853 prescribed a smallpox vaccine for all children under 3 months old. In 1867, a follow-up act extended the vaccination requirement to all children 14 and younger. Smallpox cases across Britain decreased as the government's vaccination campaign took effect. Regrettably, the campaign also sparked a rabid anti-vaccination movement. In place of vaccination's proactive approach to disease control, anti-vaxxers and the doctors who supported them proposed a reactive solution. Instead of vaccinating healthy people, they would simply quarantine sick ones and burn their belongings. In 1869, 2 citizens of Leicester were prosecuted for refusing to vaccinate their children. 12 years later, that number had grown to 3,000. The so-called Leicester method rapidly took hold in cities across England. New bouts of smallpox always followed in its wake. Why did people support anti-vaccination efforts? The reasons will sound hauntingly familiar. First, anti-vaxxers invoked bodily autonomy. The government, they said, didn't have the right to infringe upon the privacy of honest English citizens. Second, they expressed suspicion of elites, including doctors and lawmakers. Third, many anti-vaxxers mobilized religious arguments in their defense. Anti-vaccination cartoons often showed a sinister cabal of doctors in the act of feeding helpless children to monstrous cows. The imagery here carries distorted biblical allusions to Moloch, a Canaanite god who demanded human sacrifice, and to the episode of the golden calf, in which the Israelites rejected God's commandments and worshipped a cow-shaped idol. Apart from ideological opposition to vaccines, many anti-vaxxers simply cited health concerns. Blindness, for example, sometimes followed vaccination. Like today's vaccines, however, the 19th centuries were always safer than the illnesses they blocked. There was a tiny risk that a vaccine would blind you. There was an enormous risk that a real case of smallpox would blind you, kill you, and then kill all your loved ones for good measure. Despite the obvious benefits of vaccination, the British government eventually caved in to pressure from the anti-vaccination movement. In 1898, it passed a new Vaccination Act, this time with a clause allowing people to abstain from vaccines due to moral reasons. The language of this clause was vague enough that nobody would be compelled to take vaccines they didn't want. Not coincidentally, it would take 82 more years for smallpox to be totally eradicated. Unlike smallpox, the bacterial infection called tuberculosis still exists. During the 19th century, it caused 1 in every 4 deaths across Europe. Because tuberculosis symptoms tend to start mildly and progress slowly, it can take a long time for patients to realize they've contracted the disease. Although the kidneys, spine, and brain can all become infected, the lungs are the usual target. In its pulmonary form, tuberculosis causes chest pain, difficulty breathing, and a bloody cough. Consumption, as the British public called it, visibly consumes the body's resources. Patients grow thinner, paler, and weaker until they finally wither away. Tuberculosis proved especially dangerous in cities like London or Manchester, where air pollution worsened respiratory symptoms. Therefore, doctors often prescribed bed rest in a place with fresh, clean air, such as a continental spa or alpine sanitarium. Of course, not everybody could afford such treatments. Far more so than smallpox, tuberculosis is a disease of desperation. Because it's not overwhelmingly dangerous to those who have the resources to treat it, the people who get sickest tend to be the poorest members of society. This is one reason why the popular imagination linked tuberculosis to the image of a starving artist living in a drafty loft. John Keats, Frédéric Chopin, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Aubrey Beardsley all died of consumption. Today, online sources often claim that people in the 19th century found tuberculosis symptoms sexually attractive because the illness made the patient's body look so thin and pale. Like most things that you read online, this claim is pretty misleading. The quotes that it usually cites as evidence are taken wildly out of context. See, for instance, Lord Byron's obviously ironic quip that he wanted to contract tuberculosis because then all the women would say, "How interesting he looks in dying." Far from romantic or alluring, most 19th century depictions of consumption are grotesque and ugly. One character in Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment describes poor Katerina Ivanovna's slow descent into pain-induced madness. How she cried today! Her mind is unhinged. Haven't you noticed it? At one minute, she is worrying like a child that everything should be right tomorrow, the lunch and all that. Then she is wringing her hands, spitting blood, weeping, and all at once she will begin knocking her head against the wall in despair. By the end of the novel, Katerina Ivanovna is so weak that she can only weep and wail. The agonized, wasted, consumptive face, the parched, blood-stained lips, the hoarse voice, the tears unrestrained as a child's, the trustful, childish, and yet despairing prayer for help were so piteous that everyone seemed to feel for her. This is not a romanticized image. This is straightforward body horror. The myth that 19th century Europeans found tuberculosis symptoms sexually attractive stems from misinterpretations of canonical literature. Yes, many great novels feature beautiful young women dying of consumption. No, they don't suggest that such women are beautiful because of their disease. To the contrary, they dwell upon the way in which tuberculosis devours beauty, perverts it, and robs young people of what should have been a long and happy life. As a literary trope, tuberculosis appealed to writers because its gradual progression allowed for prolonged scenes of drama and suspense. Infected characters have ample time to wrestle with their fate, to speculate about whether they might recover, and, in the end, to die slowly while clutching the hands of their loved ones. It's also relevant that tuberculosis is a fairly clean disease. Patients don't break out into unsightly sores. They don't vomit or lose control of their bowels. As a result, tuberculosis was unlikely to produce a book that 19th century critics called obscene and banned from stores. The situation couldn't be more different when it came to cholera. This bacterial disease, which originates from contact with fecal matter, causes patients to produce huge quantities of vomit and diarrhea. As they become dehydrated, they seek out water to replenish their lost fluids. If they draw that water from the same source that infected them, however, it will only make their symptoms worse. Whereas tuberculosis patients can linger for years, cholera patients often die within a day of their first symptom. During the 19th century, the disease killed half the people who contracted it. Cholera's high and fast mortality rate meant that most outbreaks burned themselves out. Nevertheless, there were 6 global cholera pandemics across the 19th century. The first of these began in 1817, when the British conquest of India allowed the disease to escape its native reservoir in Bengal and spread westward along international trade routes. London endured hideous cholera outbreaks in 1832, 1848, and 1854. During the last of them, the English doctor John Snow realized that contaminated water was the cause of the disease. He even traced the origin of the 1854 outbreak, which killed more than 600 people, to a specific water pump on Broad Street. Because it seemed unnatural that you could wake up healthy and be dead by dusk, panicky Londoners accused minority groups of spreading cholera. Many writers, for example, always called it Asiatic cholera to emphasize its origin in India. Britain's minuscule Indian population was far too small to be a viable scapegoat, however. A more visible minority group, the Irish, was much easier to blame. After all, the Irish ate potatoes, which were thought to be disgusting roots unfit for human beings to consume. London's costermongers were another common target of suspicion. Were they selling spoiled food on purpose? Oftentimes, poor people as a whole were blamed for cholera outbreaks. They bred too quickly. They didn't bathe their children. They spent their days digging through garbage. In 1854, the British humor magazine Punch published a cartoon titled A Court for King Cholera, which shows ugly, animalistic paupers reveling in squalor. You can view this image on the podcast website at meltingintoair.net. it can be easy to forget just how ubiquitous disease was in Victorian culture. Our image of prim, top-hatted gentlemen bowing officiously to one another doesn't capture the reality of daily life. Good manners and fashionable clothing helped the British middle classes put a mask of order on the world, a mask that hid the ugly randomness of sudden death in the big city. Despite this mask, of course, death had a way of sneaking into banquet halls and ballrooms. Rich and poor alike shared water, air, and germs. Invisible networks of exchange connected slums and palaces. Chapter 4. Service Workers and Street Performers. Prior to the 1870s, flush toilets were extremely rare in Britain. Most people did their business in a privy built above a so-called cesspool, an artificial pit stuffed with compost. Clean privies were swept daily, and they were often decorated with fresh flowers. Provided that the cesspool didn't fill more quickly than the waste could decompose, they didn't stink. Likewise, chamber pots, which women and girls typically emptied into a privy upon waking up in the morning, usually held nothing smellier than one night's worth of urine. They were never used during the day, nor were they ever used for solid waste unless a person was too sick to leave their bed. Privies served very well in rural areas. They served far less well in major cities, where as many as 100 people might share just one cesspool. In theory, each family or group of families that shared a privy was supposed to hire sanitary workers known as nightmen to empty the cesspool once it had filled up. Unfortunately, many people would procrastinate until the last possible minute, at which point they'd learn that every nightman in the neighborhood was booked for days or even weeks on end. While families waited for the next available appointment, the mess deepened and the smell grew sickening. Nightmen, as their name suggests, worked at night. Their job was to haul wet waste, including dirty bathwater, the runoff from dye factories, blood from slaughterhouses, tannery chemicals, animal dung, and, above all, human excrement. When a client hired them to clean a privy, they began by scraping out the cesspool with a stick or shovel. After piling the waste on a cart, they hauled it to the suburbs, where they dumped it on a mountainous compost heap. Once the waste had decomposed, it was resold as fertilizer, known as night soil. Apart from the unsanitary nature of their work, nightmen in big cities such as London faced distinctive challenges. For example, urban privies were often located in a home's backyard, or in the courtyard of a large apartment block. As a result, the nightmen had to pass through someone's private residence after dark to do their job. And then, when that job was done, they had to cart the waste back through that private residence without spilling too much on the floor. The fact that urban privies weren't built to a standard code made things still harder. Cesspools were supposed to be lined with bricks, but many of them weren't. Liquid waste drained down into the soil beneath unlined privies, causing dangerous sinkholes to form. People living in London's basements often found urine and feces oozing through their walls due to the erosion of a cesspool near their residence. If such cesspools went untreated, then their contents could eventually pollute the water table. After the 1848 Public Health Act, all new houses were required to have a toilet that drained into a source of running water, like a sewer or river. This law gradually solved the problem of eroding cesspools, but it caused new problems of its own by making rivers absolutely foul. Throughout the 19th century, public health advocates begged Parliament to modernize London's medieval sewers, which were totally inadequate to meet the modern city's needs. While lawmakers deliberated, the Thames became a filthy soup that nourished clouds of flies. Alongside human waste, horse droppings were another health hazard. Some of London's poorest and most desperate residents combated the problem by declaring themselves crossing sweepers. These people adopted city blocks, which they tidied in return for handouts from pedestrians. Like blind shoelace sellers, crossing sweepers were frequently beggars by another name. Sometimes, banks or wealthy private citizens commissioned them to keep the sidewalks clean and to behave as doormen. Other crossing sweepers developed a strong, positive rapport with police officers, who sympathized with their desire for cleanliness. Because the police didn't persecute them, crossing sweepers could become familiar characters on a city block. Some regular sweepers worked the same corner for more than 40 years straight. One large gang of sweepers, all of whom were orphaned children, lived and worked around Trafalgar Square. The self-appointed captain of these sweepers was a teenager named Gander, who had a heavy lisp and no front teeth. He led a group of younger boys, including Broke His Bones, Ducky Donovan, and Stuttering Baboon, all of whom praised and admired him. The boys defended the group's only girl, 13-year-old Ellen, as though she were their sister. Gander made street art with the mud he swept from corners. He was a natural showman who'd been trained in acrobatics by a foreign man whose wife worked in a circus. Street performers were a common sight in London. For example, a blind woman known as Old Sarah made her living playing music on the hurdy-gurdy, a stringed instrument powered by a hand crank. After losing her eyesight to a childhood infection, Sarah had learned her trade inside a workhouse. She took great pride in her musicianship. The biblical King David, she reminded Henry Mayhew, had played music too. When Sarah saved enough money to leave the workhouse, she moved in with a close female friend she'd met inside it. By the 1840s, she was living with a different woman, Liza, with whom she maintained a warm relationship that may have had romantic elements. Mayhew, our only source on Sarah's life, doesn't say much on this subject. Sarah wasn't the only street artist to overcome a disability. One 31-year-old man, who'd become blind after a measles infection at age 7, found his calling carving miniature images of birds, animals, and grotesque human figures. The police often harassed him, but the crowds always came to his defense. "The working and middling classes are my best friends," he told Henry Mayhew. Mayhew also interviewed a 61-year-old writer born without hands. As a young man, he had come to London in the hopes of finding work with the East India Company. Instead, he'd found his calling making ornaments and vases on the streets. People also paid him to write messages on slips of paper. One of them said, "Naked came I into the world, and naked shall I return. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." To that message, he added his name, the date, and a memorandum that it was the writing of a man born without hands. Londoners in search of more traditional entertainment might enjoy a Punch and Judy performance. These puppet shows featured scenes of slapstick humor between Mr. Punch and his beleaguered wife, Judy. Usually, the characters were operated by a single puppeteer who brought them to life against a brightly painted background. As an assistant wrangled crowds and collected donations, the puppeteer weighed the audience's moods and adjusted the show's content to suit their wants and needs. One especially popular storyline saw Mr. Punch murder his wife and child so that he could move in with his young mistress, Polly. A skilled puppeteer could adjust this story to emphasize its tragic, comic, or sentimental elements. One such puppeteer complained that audiences had bad taste.
To the sentimental folk, I am obliged to perform very steadily and very slow, and leave out all comic words and business. They won't have no ghost, no coffin, and no devil, and that's what I call spoiling the performance entirely.
Despite his complaints, he knew that the customer was always right. When the crowd demanded a new character, he gave them Toby, Mr. Punch's dog. Within a few weeks, Punch and Judy shows were out of fashion. Punch and Toby shows were all the rage. Punch performances revealed the Victorian crowd's love of violence. So too did the celebration of Guy Fawkes Day, which became rowdier and more politically charged during the 19th century. Every November 5th, Londoners burned effigies of Guy Fawkes, the Catholic extremist who'd planted a bomb inside Parliament in 1605. Following Daniel O'Connell's successful campaign to enfranchise Catholics, which we discussed in the previous episode, bitter Protestants joined forces with English nationalists to bring Guy Fawkes' Day's buried elements of xenophobia much closer to the surface. Beneath the flickering light of burning effigies, the crowd ritually humiliated actors dressed as caricatures of foreign rulers. Russia's Tsar Nicholas I, for instance, was lampooned as Old Nick, another name for Satan. Guy Fawkes' Day only happened once per year, but you could always find a penny circus somewhere on the streets of London. In exchange for a coin or two, you could gasp and marvel at the feats of acrobats, jugglers, fire eaters, and tightrope walkers. Clowns performing improv comedy bridged different acts and interacted with the crowd. Each clown had his own unique comic persona. The one that most unsettles me is Silly Billy, a grown man who dressed and acted like a naughty schoolboy. Many clowns liked to stage run-ins with performers dressed as policemen. The tone of these sketches was always firmly anti-cop. Through trickery and wordplay, the clowns outsmarted London's officers and sometimes ended up assaulting them with their own weapons. Circus performers started training at an early age. One pair of sisters, who were not yet 8 years old, had been on stilts since they were only 3. Their father, who was also a circus worker, had taught them using patience and restraint. He told Henry Mayhew that there is a great deal of barbarity practiced in teaching children. It's very silly, because it only frightens the little things, and some children often will do much more by kindness than ill usage. This father and his daughters performed together as many as 18 times per day. Each performance lasted about 20 minutes, and when it ended, the audience donated food or money. Although the family earned enough to live, they never earned enough to keep them comfortable. Street circuses were dying out. Few of the great performing families had survived into the 1840s, and it was always growing harder to draw crowds. Circus workers faced market competition from other kinds of entertainers. One uniquely Victorian form of amusement, known as the Happy Family, capitalized on children's love of animals by exhibiting many different species living peacefully in a single cage. The proprietor of one such Happy Family showcased cats, dogs, rats, mice, guinea pigs, monkeys, pigeons, rabbits, hedgehogs, tortoises, magpies, and hawks. He told Henry Mayhew that
hundreds of people have tried their hand at happy families and have failed. The cat has killed the mice. The hawks have killed the birds. Indeed, it was anything but a happy family. By our system, however, we never have a mishap and have had animals 8 or 9 years in the cage until they've died of age. My family are fed on the best. They have as good as any nobleman's favorite dog. I'm fond of my little stock, and always was, from a child. I'd a deal sooner that anybody hurt me than any of my favorites.
the Happy Family represented life in the metropolis. Somehow, against all odds, people from radically different walks of life lived side by side with relatively little violence. That's not to say there wasn't chaos, but even chaos could be profitable in a pinch. Enterprising Londoners made money by sprinting through the city's streets and proclaiming news of murders or fires in exchange for fees from interested listeners, many of whom were illiterate. Criers earned high wages on eventful days. On slow ones, they simply invented fake news. One so-called death hunter always announced the Duke of Wellington's demise when he was short on cash. The same death hunter often thought about declaring that the Pope had passed away. The only thing that stopped him was his fear that London's Irish population would, quite literally, shoot the messenger. The destruction of the Houses of Parliament in a colossal fire was a windfall for London's town criers. Had it been the work of arsonists, a drunken member of the House of Lords, or maybe the Prime Minister had orchestrated it? Londoners loved to speculate. Today, we know the truth. In the next chapter of this episode, we'll hear the story of what really happened on the fateful day when Parliament burned to the ground. Chapter 5. The Burning of the Houses of Parliament. Early on the morning of October 16th, 1834, the Irish day labourers Patrick Furlong and Joshua Cross hauled 2 cartloads of small sticks into the furnace room beneath the House of Lords. This wasn't their usual job, but it paid their day rate, so they didn't see a reason to complain. Furlong was a plasterer and paver open to all kinds of heavy lifting. Cross, a plumber, had no pipes to fix that morning, so he agreed to serve on waste disposal. Both men reported to Mr. Richard Webley, Parliament's Clerk of Works. It should have been an uneventful Thursday. Webley asked Furlong and Cross to collect and dispose of old tally sticks. These sticks, fragments of willow wood, a few inches long, had been used in government record-keeping since the Middle Ages. Now, in the spirit of modernization, they were being phased out and replaced with paper. On October 16th, 2 cartloads of sticks needed burning. Webley's boss told him to do it outdoors, in the open air. Webley, however, worried that the sight of a large bonfire would attract unwanted crowds of poor people, who might use the flames to warm themselves in the chilly October weather. Hoping to avoid a scene, he proposed to burn the tally sticks inside the furnace underneath the House of Lords instead. His boss, who had more important things to focus on, agreed and shooed him off. A man named Richard Reynolds served as the official firelighter for the furnace under Parliament. He didn't like it when Furlong and Cross barged into his workplace and began to throw 2 cartloads worth of wood into the fire, but when they told him they were on official duty, he stood back and watched them without interfering. Around 9 a.m., Reynolds suggested that the laborers were burning the sticks too quickly. The flames were getting hotter, higher. Cross later admitted that, yes, the fire was uncomfortably large, but he insisted that he and Furlong had followed Webley's instructions to the letter. The fact that things went wrong was surely Webley's fault, not theirs. Unfortunately, none of the men knew that the furnace underneath the House of Lords had been designed for coal, not wood. Coal burns with a low flame. Wood burns with a high one. No one knew, moreover, that the chimney in the House of Lords hadn't been cleaned in a year. Since that time, large deposits of highly flammable clinker had built up inside it. And so, finally, no one realized that the buildup in the chimney suddenly caught fire around 3 p.m. The Palace of Westminster had been remodeled and expanded countless times since the 11th century. By 1834, it had become a sprawling labyrinth of poorly ventilated passageways and stairways. Smoke spread slowly through the palace. Information traveled even slower. At 4 p.m., a pair of tourists noted that the floors felt warm. Then, around 6, a woman spotted the first flames. Panicky staff members wasted almost half an hour ineffectually attempting to suppress the fire. Because no one wanted to be blamed for starting it, none of them dared to seek help. Despite their best attempts to keep it hidden, the problem became national news at 6:30 p.m., when a huge, rolling ball of explosive blue flames tore through the ceiling of the House of Lords. It could be seen from more than 20 miles away, and according to eyewitnesses, it was so bright that it made the sky look like noontime. Early Victorian London had no public fire department. Instead, the London Fire Engine Establishment, a private organization managed by for-profit insurance companies, rushed to quell the flames. As firefighters siphoned water from the River Thames, they marveled at a towering inferno that was higher, hotter, and more furious than anything they'd ever seen. Almost as soon as they began to work, they could tell that Westminster was doomed. The head firefighter told his men to spray the wings that hadn't yet caught fire. He hoped that a few small fragments of the palace complex could be saved. Meanwhile, thousands of curious spectators filled Parliament Square, clogged Westminster Bridge, and flooded the river with boats. Now, a different kind of fire threatened to erupt: the fire of class conflict. As crowds of ordinary citizens watched Parliament burn to the ground, London's policemen and its politicians watched the crowds and waited nervously for any sign of violence. What if the blaze gave people untoward ideas? Around 9:30 p.m., one eyewitness reported that
an immense column of flame burst up through the roof and the windows of the House of Lords, stunning the crowd. The whole of the upper part of the building was veiled from the eye by this outbreak of the conflagration. Bright blue coruscations, as of electric fire, played in the volume of flames, and so struck were the bystanders with the grandeur of this sight at this moment that they involuntarily clapped their hands.
During the media controversy that followed the fire, newspaper reports that some members of the crowd had clapped, laughed, and even cheered at the sight of the flames shocked and scandalized the reading public. Revolution had rocked Paris 4 years earlier, in 1830. That same year, rioters in rural England had committed arson in the name of Captain Swing. Given this context, it seemed very possible that someone had set Parliament ablaze on purpose. The mood among the fire watchers grew into a subject of intense debate. One journalist reported expressions of terror, wonder, and wild enjoyment on observers' faces. A parliamentary official noted that the crowd preserved a calm and dignified demeanor. Some eyewitnesses, however, claimed that while the flames consumed the House of Commons, onlookers cried out, "The abominable Poor Law Bill is burned," or "'Tis a pity that the bishops are not in it." The historian Carolyn Shenton suggests that the tense scene unfolding here remained peaceful only because the police and the crowds were both too frightened of each other to behave aggressively. According to her interpretation, October 16th was a night defined by anxious memories of violent clashes between police and protesters, not by a shared sense of patriotic duty, grief, or shock. By 11 p.m., the River Thames glowed brightly with reflected flames. Parliament's roofs and floors had fallen in. Its chambers had been gutted. Clouds of white smoke rolled out from the burning wreck, and stars of blue flame shot from the windows like fireworks. Newspapers compared the sight to pandemonium, the infernal palace in John Milton's poem Paradise Lost. Parliament appeared to glow red-hot with fervent heat. The sound of cackling occasionally rose above the roar of flames. One gleeful member of the House of Lords, for instance, openly rejoiced as he watched Commons burn. "Damn the House of Commons," he cried. "Let it blaze away." Meanwhile, the radical populist lawmaker William Cobbett was already planning his defense of the ordinary men and women whom he knew the rich would blame for what was happening. 4 days after the fire, Cobbett published a newspaper article saying that even if the crowds had cheered when Parliament burned, they'd been right to do so. Inside the building's scarred and smoking hallways, London's legislators had passed countless acts that treaded upon common people's dignity. By 5 a.m. on Friday, October 17th, the flames had finally subsided. But most of Parliament had been reduced to ashes. The Houses of Lords and Commons were both completely desolated. The law courts had been badly damaged. Only a few buildings, including Westminster Hall, had been spared. Miraculously, not a single life was lost. Investigators almost immediately determined that no one bore complete responsibility for the fire. Furlong and Cross had burned the tally sticks as asked. They would have lost their jobs if they'd done any differently, and no safety regulations were in place to stop them from complying with their boss's orders. Palace staff didn't report the fire because they feared retaliation from their supervisors. Westminster burned quickly because it was constructed almost totally out of wood, because its long hallways funneled flames from one side of the palace to the other, and because winds had been high all day long. The tide on the River Thames was low when firefighters first arrived on scene, which made it hard for them to draw enough water to suppress the blaze. Huge crowds accidentally blocked the path of first responders, and most of the people in those crowds passively watched events unfold instead of actively helping the relief efforts. From start to end, the burning of Parliament was nothing more or less than a tragicomic sequence of accidents, blunders, and coincidences. Given that investigators publicized this information and emphasized that no one was to blame, it's striking how many newspaper articles revolved around wild speculation and finger-pointing. In essence, the real story of the fire was too complicated for the press to sensationalize, so partisan journalists massaged the facts to suit their own agendas. Corrupt politicians were to blame, some said. They had hired their cronies to renovate and expand the Palace of Westminster without any regard for fire safety. Other reporters disagreed. They blamed the fire on Irish day laborers, who didn't have the necessary skills to do their jobs. Both sides of the debate compared their opponents to the Catholic terrorist Guy Fawkes, and both accused each other of dishonoring governmental institutions. The upper classes clutched their pearls when they heard people singing a popular street ballad, whose chorus included the line, "Oh, what a flare-up! Crikey, Bill, what a jolly flare-up!" Meanwhile, the nation's poor complained that lawmakers were more concerned with filing insurance claims than with rebuilding. And what about rebuilding? In July 1835, Parliament announced a national competition to design a new Palace of Westminster. After nearly 100 British architects and masons submitted anonymous proposals, the panel selected entry number 67 as the winner. It turned out to be the work of Augustus Pugin, a 24-year-old architect with a taste for Gothic revivalism. With all the pompousness of a young artist, Pugin had rejoiced at the burning of Parliament, which he'd regarded as a hideous old building. "There is nothing much to regret," he said. "It was a glorious sight to see it flying and crackling and smoking." No one could have known it at the time, but it would take a quarter-century to rebuild what the fire had destroyed in a few hours. Pugin wouldn't live to see his project finished. Of course, not everything in Parliament could be rebuilt. Despite the heroic efforts of volunteer salvage teams, the blaze consumed almost all of the House of Commons' parchments, papers, and records. One parliamentary official praised the fire for destroying what he called a mass of useless encumbrances. In contrast, today's historians perceive it as one of the worst archival disasters of the 19th century. Government surveys, minute books, witness testimonials, petitions, and voting records, many of them dating back as far as 1495, were all reduced to ashes. Literally hundreds of years of parliamentary history have been lost forever. By early 1835, even the memory of a fire that had happened just a few months previously was fading. That year, the artist J.M.W. Turner publicly displayed two paintings titled "The Burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons." As you can see on the podcast's website, meltingintoair.net, each canvas centers on a dreamlike and impressionistic blur of orange flames that seeps into a blue-gray sky. In the middle distance, the River Thames reflects and distorts the fire like a dirty mirror. Near to the viewer, a large, dark crowd of anonymous faces watches the disaster. Most of their expressions are invisible. The rest seem deliberately ambiguous. 19th-century art critics didn't know what to make of Turner's paintings. Many of them complained that the scenes were too dark to appreciate. Others grumbled that they were historically inaccurate. These critics wanted grand narrative paintings that would canonize a patriotic story about overcoming national tragedy. Instead, they received a confusing muddle of colors that didn't even look like anything unless you stood a few feet back and squinted your eyes. In time, art historians would start to perceive Turner's paintings much more favorably. His depictions of the Parliament fire forecast his later, more magnificent experiments in light and color. They also invite viewers to reflect upon the meaning of the mass of spectators. Is this a peaceful crowd or a tumultuous mob? The question of the crowd reflected a debate about the London poor and, above all, about the most desperate members of the city's underclass. In the next chapter of this episode, we'll meet some of London's lumpen proletariat, its beggars, prostitutes, and pickpockets, and we'll consider the extent to which they actually deserved their reputation as a danger to society at large. Chapter 6. The Lumpen Proletariat. Now, our walking tour through London brings us face to face with a class of people whose contemporaries thought they were the lowest of the low. Henry Mayhew called them those who won't work. Karl Marx, who lived in London for the last 3 decades of his life, preferred the term lumpen proletariat. He understood these people as the desperate strata of society, whose traditional livelihoods had been destroyed by industrial capitalism. In big cities, Marx maintained, Britons jobless, homeless, and hungry found new lives as beggars, prostitutes, and thieves. They became a rabble, a mob, loyal to no one, hated by all, parasitic, dangerous, degenerate, and purchasable by the highest bidder. Accounts like Marx's are polemical. Although he always championed the working proletariat, he despised the jobless lumpen proletariat, whom he thought offered nothing useful to society. Most middle and upper-class people in Britain shared his prejudices. They assumed that poverty went hand in hand with immorality. You were jobless because you were lazy. You were broke because you had no self-control. Good people ought to fear and shun you because immorality produces crime, and crime, after all, is contagious. Matters of public health demanded that the dangerous classes be confined to quarantine in workhouses or prisons. Despite their bad reputation, many members of the so-called lumpen proletariat committed no crime other than the crime of being poor. Scripture reminded Christians that the poor would always be with them. In context, the message constitutes a call to action. Good people must be charitable toward the needy. Some Victorians, however, turned that call to action on its head. If the poor will always be with you, then what's the point of trying to uplift them? Because Jesus says that there will inevitably be haves and have-nots, the Christian's job is less to help the poor than to determine which of them deserves a Christian's help. To that end, Mayhew reminds his middle-class readers that heaven has given them brains as well as hearts. Charity, he says, is knowing when to spurn mere human animals who eat, drink, and sleep without providing anything worthwhile to society at large. Systemic prejudices often lurked beneath Victorians' surface-level bias against beggars. For example, considering that London's population of Indian immigrants was vanishingly small, Indian panhandlers endured a wildly disproportionate amount of racial animosity. Mayhew calls these people snake-eyed Asiatics, and he warns his readers to mistrust them when they claim they're high-caste Brahmins who have fallen on hard times. One beggar of South Asian descent, Joalika, told Mayhew's associates that he'd once worked as an interpreter for an Englishman stationed in India. That Englishman had brought him to London, where Joalika formed what he called a connection with a white woman. After she grew pregnant with his child, Joalika knew that his employer and his parents would both punish him. Therefore, he quit his job as an interpreter and vowed never to return to India. Since that time, he'd taken several different wives in London. All of them were white, several had carried his children. Joalika made his living as a crossing sweeper and a beggar. He liked England. He did not like England's policemen. Compared to Indian beggars, impoverished sailors were more common on the streets of London. Nautical wages were low, and they were easy to squander in port. Occupational hazards, moreover, left many sailors crippled or chronically ill. Sympathetic people often gave disabled sailors food or money in return for their service to the nation. According to Henry Mayhew, this generosity had spawned an epidemic of phony sailors who faked injuries to take advantage of credulous people. Mayhew tells his readers how to spot these con men. Their faces bore the stamp of diabolically low cunning. Their skin had none of the manly bronze tan that true sailors possessed. They wore stereotypical costumes that included black bandanas, bare feet, gold earrings, and tattoos of mermaids or anchors. They targeted naive young boys who loved adventure stories, as well as kindly old ladies who had grandchildren at sea. In contrast to these phony sailors, Mayhew claims, real ones spoke forthrightly to adult men, whom they always called Sir. They never bragged of their heroic deeds at sea. In fact, they almost never left the docks, where they worked hard performing honest jobs instead of begging for money. Patriotic middle-class Victorians liked to believe this story. It was preferable to admitting that the British state abandoned wounded veterans who had outlived their usefulness. The idea that most beggars were liars appealed to audiences eager to pass moral judgment. The spectacle of prostitution proved enticing for similar reasons. The 19th century witnessed an explosion of writing about prostitutes. Investigative journalism, Christian tracts, public health pamphlets, and pornographic novels circulated widely among middle-class readers. Most of this writing was produced by men. Much of it was filled with sexually titillating language, which the authors sometimes wrote in Latin to keep women, children, and the poor from reading it. Victorian writers taxonomize prostitutes as though they were animal species. We hear tell of board lodgers, sailors' women, soldiers' women, park women, clandestine prostitutes, trafficked women, and so forth. What unites them, Mayhew says, is that they put a woman's charms to vile uses. According to his definition of the term, prostitution is the surrendering of a woman's virtue in any manner that excites our moral disgust, even if it's not explicitly against the law. Two elements of this definition deserve our attention. First, it falsely assumes that only women worked as prostitutes. Second, it treats prostitution less as a formal legal offense than as a term of moral stigma designed to enforce unspoken social rules about appropriate feminine conduct. In essence, prostitution meant whatever men disdained to see in mothers, wives, and daughters. Male editors compiled many of the first-hand testimonies that survive from Victorian prostitutes. As a result, we tend to hear about these women's physical beauty before we hear about the circumstances of their lives. For instance, a woman known as Swindling Sal was 27 years old, with a round face, fat cheeks, and strong arms. She was not, we're told, altogether destitute of good looks. Sal lived in various lodging houses on the impoverished East End of London. She was known as a bunter, that is, a woman who took a room, stayed there briefly, used it as a makeshift brothel, and then ran away without paying the landlord. Her conscience didn't trouble her for this. She told one of Henry Mayhew's associates that most landlords were Jews, and that, in her words, cheating a Jew was no sin because they were Christ killers and crucifiers. Sal claimed to make a few pounds per week sleeping with clients. She especially enjoyed spending the night with soldiers, who made her feel safe in a dangerous city. The only downside was, these soldiers didn't pay their dues the morning afterward. Unlike Swindling Sal, a woman nicknamed Lushing Lou looked haggard. Rather than bright, provocative costumes, she dressed herself in simple clothing. When Mayhew's associates pressured her to tell them her life's story, she resisted. "I'm a seduced milliner," she shrugged. "I'm anything you like." Whatever she had been before, she was now an alcoholic who sang dirty songs about her clients.
"The first I met a cornet was in a regiment of dragoons. I gave him what he didn't like and stole his silver spoons."
Mayhew's accounts of Swindling Sal and Lushing Lou provide a brief, unsentimental glimpse into the life of London's most exploited women. Few of them ever got the chance to share their stories. Of Mary Brothers, for example, we know just one sobering fact. She was murdered by a client who accused her of giving him a venereal disease. Mary's story reminds us that male violence of one kind or another surrounded London's sex workers. All around them, crowds of pimps and panderers flocked like vampire bats sucking the wages that comprised their lifeblood. Due partly to the interference of these men, most prostitutes earned very little money. In fact, the vast majority of 19th-century sex workers were lower-class women who viewed prostitution as a short-term measure that allowed them to survive until they found a better job. If they slept with their landlord, he'd forgive their rent for the next week. If they did a favor for the grocer down the street, he'd ensure their children didn't starve. Ultimately, Victorian writers' borderline pathological eagerness to define prostitutes as a specific class of human being reveals their desire to distinguish these women from the nation's decent mothers, wives, and daughters. In real life, however, the distinction was rarely so obvious. Even more than prostitution, thieving was a part-time job. Barring a few rare exceptions, people stole simply to make ends meet. The opportunities for theft were bountiful. 19th-century London was home to a commodity economy propelled by mass production. There were, quite literally, more things to steal than there had ever been in any place at any time in human history. When middle-class Victorians worried about thieves, they worried, first and foremost, about house servants. If a woman misplaced her silver spoons, bracelets, rings, or necklaces, or if the household's weekly supply of tea and sugar seemed to disappear too quickly, her thoughts often turned against the help. Most servants were lower middle-class people, and many of them were young women. As a general rule, they were imagined to be capable of virtue, but susceptible to vice. Consequently, middle-class families looking to employ a servant typically required applicants to submit character references and employment histories. They were especially wary of young women who appeared to covet pretty jewelry or fancy clothing. Such people might sneak their good-for-nothing boyfriends into the house at night. Or, worse yet, they might seduce the family patriarch and bear his children. In the middle-class imagination, fears about the household's property dovetailed with fears about the servant class's sexual availability. Whereas servants were alleged to steal behind closed doors, needy or homeless children stole in the open air. Mayhew encountered many orphans in the streets of London. They looked, in his words, squalid and unwashed, with their hair clustered in wild disorder, and they traveled in large packs like wild dogs. Many of these orphans were believed to be the sons and daughters of the city's Irish Catholic immigrants. Most of their crimes were nonviolent. They picked pockets, swiped fruit from costermongers, or tricked other, more privileged children into giving them family heirlooms. Nevertheless, some members of the middle class complained that police officers treated young offenders far too leniently. They muttered darkly that nonviolent crimes often turned savage, and that Irish boys inevitably grew up into Irish men. To that end, London's small cohort of professional burglars was often imagined to consist of men who had been trained as thieves since childhood. They picked locks with skeleton keys, slipped thin rods into window sashes to undo the catch, entered homes through attic windows or trapdoors, climbed waterspouts, leaped across roofs, or broke through brick walls into adjoining buildings. Once they'd gathered anything that they could get their hands on, they wrapped it in a carpet bag and carried it by train into another neighborhood, where they could sell it without anybody recognizing it as stolen property. If there's one thing to take away from this brief survey of the British lumpen proletariat, it's that Victorian writers who aligned poverty with crime portrayed them both with an attitude of moral disgust that remains rhetorically familiar even today. Many middle-class journalists liked nothing better than to scandalize their audiences with salacious stories of life in lower-class neighborhoods called rookeries, where every single person was imagined to be simultaneously ugly and vicious. These stories excused and justified appalling living standards by framing them as punishments for moral failures. Overcrowded tenements were packed with worn-out Irish women peeling potatoes. Ragged children, shabbily dressed and half-naked, lounged in profoundest ignorance and debasement. Meanwhile, lewd and debased prostitutes prowled the streets at night, hoping to plunder drunken men. The images and stories such as these originated from a place of truth. Nonetheless, the writers who selected and deployed them did so with a very purposeful agenda. Every story of the city's lumpen proletariat was, to some extent, a work of fiction. But one of them towered above all the others. Chapter 7. Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. Listeners should be advised that this chapter includes references to domestic violence. If you're sensitive to this subject, then I recommend skipping ahead to the episode's conclusion. When we left the 25-year-old Charles Dickens in the previous episode, he'd become a literary celebrity after publishing his first novel, The Pickwick Papers, in 20 serialized installments. Today, I want to analyze his darker, shorter second novel, Oliver Twist, which also appeared in installments, this time from February 1837 to April 1839. For the sake of convenience, I've just called The Pickwick Papers Dickens' first novel, and Oliver Twist his second. The truth is a little more complicated. Dickens wrote these books simultaneously, and the early issues of Oliver Twist appeared in print before The Pickwick Papers had finished its initial serial run. If you read these novels alongside each other, you can spot suspicious synchronicities between them. For example, Oliver enters the criminal underworld at almost the exact same time that Mr. Pickwick finds himself in prison. In light of connections like this one, the literary scholar Stephen Marcus has joked that Charles Dickens is the only writer whose second book informed his first. If you've watched one of Oliver Twist's many adaptations, then you'll be familiar with the broad outline of its plot. At the beginning of the story, the young orphan Oliver Twist lives inside a workhouse in the gloomy English town of Mudfog. The boys there are overworked and underfed by a cruel overseer, who's famously horrified when Oliver has the audacity to ask him for more gruel. By chapter 8, the disaffected Oliver has run away to London. There, he falls in among a gang of child pickpockets led by the artful Dodger, a snub-nosed, flat-browed, common-faced boy who's wise beyond his years and who dresses in oversized clothing made for adult men. The Dodger leads Oliver to the child gang's hideout and introduces him to their patron and protector, a professional criminal named Fagin. Dickens describes Fagin as a very shriveled old Jew whose villainous and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. When Oliver first sees him, he's hunched over a fire with a toasting fork in his hand, looking like Satan himself. Under Fagin's tutelage, Oliver becomes a thief. One day, he's assigned to steal from Mr. Brownlow, an upper-middle-class gentleman. The theft goes wrong, Oliver is caught, but the kindly Mr. Brownlow takes him in and expresses interest in his future. Meanwhile, Fagin grows terrified that Oliver will snitch on his gang. Therefore, he dispatches the hulking, scowling criminal Bill Sikes to kidnap the boy from Mr. Brownlow's home before it's too late. The middle section of the novel features an elaborate back-and-forth struggle between Fagin's allies and Mr. Brownlow's, both of whom want Oliver in their custody. While Fagin and Sikes team up with Monks, a mysterious man with knowledge of Oliver's past, Mr. Brownlow investigates the boy's paternity, alongside Rose Maylie, a warm and beautiful young woman. In the final section of the novel, everything goes wrong. The artful Dodger is arrested and transported to Australia. Meanwhile, Sikes' girlfriend Nancy, a kind-hearted prostitute, begins to secretly collaborate with Mr. Brownlow and Rose Maylie so that Oliver can escape Fagin's clutches. When Sikes learns of Nancy's betrayal, he beats her to death. Sikes flees the scene of the crime, but a mob pursues him, and he accidentally hangs himself while attempting to escape across the rooftops. Fagin, who has been arrested, is sentenced to execution. As the novel concludes, Mr. Brownlow finally discovers the truth of Oliver's past. His late mother was Rose Maylie's older sister, Oliver, accordingly, is Rose's long-lost nephew. And, more surprisingly, he has inherited a vast fortune from his deceased parents. Monks, the mysterious man with knowledge of Oliver's past, turns out to be his evil, illegitimate half-brother, who has dedicated his life to stealing the boy's inheritance. Oliver forgives Monks and gives him half the money, but Monks squanders it and eventually dies in prison in a distant part of the New World. Oliver's fate is more pleasant. Now wealthy and beloved, he lives out his days happily ever after as Rose Maylie's nephew and Mr. Brownlow's adopted son. What should we make of this novel? I discussed its workhouse scenes in episode 2, so I won't rehash them here. I'm also going to save my comments on Fagin, the 19th century's most infamous anti-Semitic caricature, for a future episode on Jewish life in Victorian Britain. Today, then, I want to draw your attention to 4 main elements of Oliver Twist: its literary structure, its sociological agenda, its portrayal of domestic violence, and its improbably miraculous ending. Compared to the Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist is a more tightly plotted book. It centers on the adventures of a single main character, it contains a smaller number of digressions, and it's almost 150,000 words shorter than its predecessor. Nevertheless, the plot is still quite loose and baggy by 21st century standards. For one thing, it's packed with superfluous characters like Oliver's half-brother Monks. The power of the novel's climax depends partly on the mystery of his identity, but the book gives readers little reason to invest their interest in it. Monks barely appears in the story, and even when he does, he always takes a back seat to antagonists like Sykes and Fagin. Because Monks is almost totally extraneous to the narrative, he gets cut from nearly every single adaptation of Oliver Twist. In addition to the novel's superfluous characters, modern readers might find fault with its protagonist. Actually, it's hard to call Oliver a protagonist at all. Although he occupies the center of the story's social web, he exerts almost no influence on the course of its plot. In Chapter 2, he tells the workhouse overseer that he wants more gruel, and that's just about the last time he does anything at all. In fact, it's not even Oliver's idea to ask for more gruel in the first place. The other boys peer pressure him to do it. Unlike the character familiar to us from adaptations, the book version of Oliver isn't proactively kind or generous. For example, he gives half of his inheritance to Monks because Mr. Brownlow asks him to, not because he recognizes it as the right thing to do. Frankly, I find Oliver an irritating character who spends about 300 pages simpering and swooning. 19th century readers were more patient with his personality. From their perspective, the passive child was a good child. Oliver's passivity makes him a blank slate, capable of traveling anywhere the plot sees fit to move him. This is important because, throughout Oliver Twist, Dickens emphasizes a dichotomy between two social spaces. On the one hand, there's London's grim, grimy criminal underworld. Fagin's den, for instance, is black with age and dirt. On the other hand, the book explores the pleasant, peaceful space of London's suburbs. Rose Maylie's home is nestled among green hills and rich woods, in a lovely spot full of freshness and glistening water. Throughout this episode, I've mentioned that middle-class writers often imagined strict divisions between good and bad kinds of people. You can see that logic at work here in Oliver Twist, where everyone except the title character tends to remain within their designated good or bad social spaces. Dickens often makes the strict dichotomy between these spaces feel unnatural and even eerie. According to the novelist and literary critic Henry James,
"The scenes and figures intended to comfort and cheer are more subtly sinister than the frank badness and horrors. The nice people and the happy moments frighten me almost as much as the low and the awkward."
In James's account, Oliver Twist looks almost like the dreamlike world of David Lynch's film Blue Velvet, where uncanny horrors lurk beneath the happy surface of suburbia. The book's uncanny atmosphere should temper our faith in its realism. Today, it's common to hear people say that Dickens' novels offer us a window into the Victorian era. If these novels are a window, though, then they must be a window of stained glass. Fiction colors, frames, and narrates life in ways that frustrate efforts to perceive the real world behind it. Movies like Breakfast at Tiffany's, Taxi Driver, and American Psycho, for instance, each present us with a plausible rendition of Manhattan, but none of them offers the whole or the exclusive truth. They're caricatures of the city as it really looks. Keeping this principle in mind, what can we learn about Victorian London from a book such as Oliver Twist? To begin, Dickens makes sense of the criminal underworld's chaos by depicting its inhabitants as recognizable stock types. Fagin is almost always described as the Jew. The Artful Dodger is a pickpocket. Nancy is a prostitute. Bill Sikes is a burglar. Only Oliver proves hard to recognize and classify. In this context, the other character's obsession with his ancestry recalls a sociologist's attempt to figure out exactly what he is. The most disturbing scenes in Oliver Twist foreground the stories of the London lumpen proletariat. Bill Sikes might be the most upsetting villain Dickens ever wrote. Whereas most Dickensian antagonists are funny or charming in ways that clearly mark them as fictional, Sikes is just a bully who abuses women, children, and animals because he's bigger and stronger than they are. He hits his girlfriend, Nancy, and she pleads with him to stop, and he refuses. Nonetheless, she stays with him because of love, or loyalty, or fear. 19th-century readers made sense of Nancy's plight by calling her a fallen woman. She'd had sex outside of marriage, which foreclosed her from respectable society forever afterward. Fallen women were regarded as objects of pity and fear. Pity, because any careless girl might fall after one night of weakness. Fear, because the life of every fallen woman ended horribly, regardless of the other actions she committed. Nancy's actions, it's worth saying, are consistently loving and kind. Unlike the criminal underworld's other characters, she cares deeply for Oliver and acts heroically to keep him safe. During the boy's darkest hour, she even dares to reach outside her social sphere and contact the genteel Rose Maylie for assistance. Narratively speaking, Nancy's womanhood allows her to bridge the gap between the middle classes and the lumpen proletariat. It's impossible to think of Rose connecting with adult male criminals like Fagin or Bill Sikes. Nancy, in contrast, constitutes an unthreatening object of charity to uplift and nurture. When she appeals to Rose for help, she cries, "Your haughty religious people would have held their heads up to me as I am tonight, and preached of flames and vengeance. Oh, dear lady, why aren't those who claim to be God's own folks as gentle and as kind to us poor wretches as you, who, having youth and beauty and all that they have lost, might be a little proud instead of so much humbler?" In scenes like this one, the novel's attitude toward Nancy is paternalistic. Readers are supposed to think that she deserves our sympathy. At the same time, we're supposed to think that she deserves it only to a limited extent. Dickens clearly adores Nancy's character, but he also goes out of his way to punish her, and thereby to insist that fallen women, pitiable though they are ultimately unforgivable. This brings us to the book's most notorious episode, Nancy's murder. The scene's violence is shocking and explicit even by modern standards. Sikes, who has just learned of Nancy's meeting with Rose Maylie, storms home with dilated nostrils and heaving breast. He throws open the door, grabs his girlfriend by the head and throat, and drags her into the middle of the room. She begs him not to hurt her. He ignores her. Instead, he grabs his pistol and beat it twice with all the force he could summon upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell, nearly blinded with the blood that rained down from a deep gash in her forehead. But, raising herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, Rose Maylie's own, and, holding it up in her folded hands as high towards heaven as her feeble strength would let her, breathed one prayer for mercy to her Maker. It was a ghastly figure to look upon, the murderer, staggering backward to the wall and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. This scene of domestic violence, which is much longer and more gruesome than the excerpt I've quoted here, held Dickens' original audience in rapt and horrified fascination. It's clinically detailed and unflinchingly bleak. It offers no hope of redemption whatsoever. More than any other moment in the novel, it forces readers to observe the hideous reality of urban poverty. In the years after Dickens published Oliver Twist, Nancy's murder and Sykes's flight from justice became some of his favorite passages to read aloud in public. His voice would climb and crack, and he'd shed solemn tears before a weeping and astonished crowd. These scenes made for an effective showpiece because, much like today's true crime podcasts, they invited listeners to revel in graphic descriptions of violence against women under the pretense that their perverse, voyeuristic thirst for blood fulfilled a useful social purpose. Within the context of 19th-century culture, spectacles of violence against middle-class virgins like Rose Maylie were taboo. In contrast, the lower-class Nancy's status as a fallen woman placed her outside the realm of cultural protection and transformed her death into a moral lesson. So much for Nancy's fate. Why does Oliver Twist as a whole end like it does? To answer this question, we need to recognize the powerlessness of the story's police officers, who play almost no role in the villain's downfall. The police successfully arrest the Artful Dodger, but he's just a child. They fail to arrest Sykes, who only comes to justice when he accidentally hangs himself. Up until the moment when the police catch Fagin, Mr. Brownlow has to pressure them to do their jobs against their will. Even then, they can't do the most crucial job of all, which is to solve the mystery of Oliver's paternity. According to the literary critic D.A. Miller, the absence or inefficiency of police officers in Victorian novels cedes legal and judicial power to middle-class civilians like Brownlow, who receive the authority to investigate and prosecute crimes on their own. Brownlow, in turn, becomes a stand-in for skilled readers of fiction, who are always seeking clues about characters' motives, making predictions about what they might do next, and pursuing them from scene to scene. In Miller's argument, reading a novel resembles detective work. You're always nodding your head in agreement, that sounds like a likely story, or you're shaking your head in disbelief. That scene doesn't seem true to life at all. Where police power exists in Oliver Twist, it exists primarily in the vague, looming possibility of capital punishment. The story's two adult male criminals are hanged. Its juvenile offenders, who remain sympathetic for as long as they're still underage, must face the unappealing fate of growing up. The Artful Dodger already dresses like a little man. As for Oliver, his surname, Twist, reminded 19th-century readers of the gallows by evoking twisted rope. The pun here implies that the novel's primary challenge is to imagine how a needy child can avoid maturing into an adult delinquent. To meet this challenge, Dickens deploys another kind of twist, the twist ending. As the plot draws to a close, the title character miraculously inherits a vast family fortune that allows him to live happily ever after. Nancy, Fagin, and Bill Sykes are killed, and the Artful Dodger is exiled to Australia. Against all odds, then, Oliver breaks cleanly and completely with the criminal underworld that formerly appeared to be his destiny. Needless to say, this fairy tale solution offered no real remedy for urban poverty. The ending of Oliver Twist, however, was the only one available within the self-imposed limits of the novel's moderate politics. Dickens understood that needy children couldn't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. At the same time, the unfeeling cruelty of the workhouse system disillusioned him with incremental parliamentary reform. If poor children couldn't save themselves, and if the government couldn't be relied upon to save them, then there was nothing left to do but hope for an unlikely miracle. This was not a political solution, but it outraged no one. It appealed to all. It made for brilliant, imaginative fiction, and, in doing so, it guaranteed that Oliver Twist quickly became, and always remained, one of Charles Dickens' most beloved novels. Conclusion. Let it blaze away. When you live in a big city like New York or London, you can't help but wonder at its scale. The metropolis belongs to everyone and no one. Of course, you have your favorite haunts, your cherished secret spots, but no matter how at home you feel, you're still a stranger almost everywhere you go. You recall your first impressions of your neighborhood, realize how wrong they were, and wonder what about your current knowledge will be incorrect within a week or a month or a year. After all, new urban legends spring up every day. Who is Zardulu the Mythmaker? Was Pizza Rat a hoax? Buildings rise and fall. Street traffic roars. Everything transforms. The city seems to melt or blaze away before your eyes. I find Victorian London captivating because it's one of the first cities in human history whose wealth of primary records exceeds what any one person could possibly read in a lifetime. Faced with this overwhelming quantity of source material, our challenge is to organize it in a way that makes it meaningful, while still acknowledging that someone else's view of London might look very different from our own. How do we find sources that do justice to the everyday experiences of the marginalized? Our most famous literary records all come from middle-class writers. Although they often speak about the poor, they rarely let the poor speak for themselves. Even Henry Mayhew had a taste for the grotesque. His desire to shock and to scandalize inspired him to seek out quirky individuals more frequently than people who embodied general trends. Of course, despite its limits as a catalog of 19th-century statistics, Mayhew's journalism has enormous value as a work of anthropology. In addition to its vibrant narrative, it reminds us of the fact that social worlds cross-pollinate and overlap with one another. Jack Black, the rat catcher whom we met at the beginning of this episode, appealed to people from all walks of life. His story is a nexus point where many strands of human history become entangled. 19th-century London's tangle of human voices, its noise, mess, and confusion, defined the period's art and literature. Victorian Britain's great creative works reject clean lines and well-packed boxes. These works are the art of the rubbish heap, the art of taxidermists and of scavengers. The novel, for instance, combines old forms in unexpected ways, repackages traditional materials for modern audiences, and insists that order might emerge from chaos. London's overcrowded urban ecosystem compelled its inhabitants to wring the last few scraps of value out of objects that lacked obvious material utility. Toshers, mudlarks, and purefinders scrounged through heaps of waste and garbage. Jack Black transformed filthy vermin into precious household pets. His work embodies the Victorian aesthetic ethos of recycling elements from lowbrow forms into something highbrow and respectable enough to analyze at dinner. In the fancy rat's soft fur, we see the forerunner of Bleak House, Middlemarch, or Heart of Darkness. The next episode of this podcast will explore how Britain's high and low cultures fed upon each other in the 1830s. Although the urban masses and the oligarchic ruling class confined themselves to separate social spheres, the period's art and literature reveal that they were never actually as separate as they liked to think. As we examine the trashiest depths of mass media alongside the loftiest heights of official society, we'll immerse ourselves in the delicious excesses of penny dreadfuls. We'll hear the eerie urban legend of the otherworldly spring-heeled Jack, and will enroll in rugby school, one of the real-life inspirations behind Harry Potter's Hogwarts. I'm Brian Reinken. I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks for listening to Melting into Air. For more information about this episode, you can visit our website at meltingintoair.net, where we've posted show notes, artwork, and a movie list. If you'd like to help keep the show running, please visit our Patreon for exclusive content and other membership benefits. And if you have any comments or questions, you can reach us at info@meltingintoair.net. This is Brian Reinken. See you in episode 4.